Well, my energy cell count is at 0, so I guess we're talking about the vacuum tube launcher. This thing is pretty awesome. It kind of always has been, and as per usual with the 12.0 update that you've heard me talk about a million times, it got a 40% damage boost. So not only did it get better than it already was when it was already pretty good, but it now has a fancy new Chain Lightning 6 perk. Now, I am going to show the perks that I have on this thing right away, but if you're just coming for the perks, please let me explain myself later down the line. Regardless, this is the copy that was given to me, and we now have the eliminating an enemy causes a chain lightning strike up to 6 enemies. Now, it should be noted that if I'm not mistaken, all vacuum tube weapons now have this 6 perk, which includes the shotgun, makes it insanely good, and the sword also makes it insanely good. Both of those will be getting videos on my channel. I can't promise when, but they will be coming out, and if I try to remember, I'll link all my vacuum tube weapon videos in the description below. I think this might be the first one I've covered. And that's of course excluding the vacuum tube bow, which has a different 6 perk where only hitting the enemy can chain a lightning, up to 6 enemies. And that's actually pretty good because the bow doesn't always eliminate, and that just makes it a lot more effective. You can hit a smasher over and over and chain everything around it. I'm going to link my best bows video where I talk about the vacuum tube bow more because the video of it itself is quite outdated. It was recorded right when it came out, and they've done a lot of good things to this weapon since. If I record a new video on that, that'll be linked below, and I encourage you to check it out because I think this weapon deserves some more time in the spotlight. But of course, today we're talking about the vacuum tube launcher. I already said it's a powerhouse, and that chain lightning only allows it to hit more enemies. I don't off the top of my head know what all the 6 perk options were, but Editing Beast can put some of them on the screen for you here. I mean, I think you can get Affliction on it, even so, that's not going to help a ton, and the eliminating an enemy chaining out is actually quite effective. Now, I recorded all of my gameplay in an exploding death burst mission, so a lot of the enemies are healing each other, and it doesn't really show as well, but trust me, in an encampment, it's going to look a lot like this one, where there were a lot of baby zombies, and the exploding death burst didn't really affect as much, so you can see that in about 2 shots, it deleted the entire encampment. Now, with some bigger enemies, you're not going to 2-shot every encampment, but if you can group things together, this thing will delete everything, and it makes it a very, very fun weapon to use. But of course, there's always a downside to these weapons, and given my quip at the beginning of this, you can probably figure it is extremely expensive. Holy crap, you are going to burn through your energy cells if you use this like I did. Obviously, I was just showcasing it. I use this weapon a lot more than I really should. You should reserve a launcher if you're using it as a secondary, as like a group area of effect kind of eliminator. You should be saving this for encampments, crowds of zombies, when there are a lot of things all at once, and then clean things up with your shotgun or whatever you're using. That is also a good thing to note that I am using a shotgun loadout in this. I don't like to record these videos with a loadout that buffs rocket launchers in any way because A, I don't think most people are running that way, and B, I don't think they need a boost. If you do want to make your rocket launchers absolutely insane, I'll link my video down below. It's still relevant. It's worth checking out. You can make launchers way better than you ever knew. Spoiler alert, you're not going to have to reload nearly as often. And no, I'm not talking about the reload glitch. I know it's a thing. It's not going to affect any of my review here. I still recommend a reload perk because they're going to patch it. I wouldn't get used to it. But expanding on that cost, it's not all bad. So yes, you are using 30 energy cells per shot. Yes, even though the deatomizer uses 35 cells per shot, I do think that weapon's a lot more bang for its buck. And I don't love mentioning other weapons to compare because the deatomizer is not what we're talking about, but it's hard to recommend one weapon when a better alternative exists. That said, you are shooting 3 projectiles with this weapon, which actually kind of impacts some of my perk recommendations. And by that, I mean while you're shooting, I've probably shown it a ton in the gameplay already, you can move your cursor, or if you're playing on console, you can move your joystick while you're firing to hit multiple enemies with the same shot in very, very different areas of the map. And that's a really effective way to use this thing. And that impacts the way that I think about this weapon because I never like recommending crit on these weapons, unless it's like the deatomizer, which fires lots of different projectiles, and you can see where I'm going with this. Because you're firing 3 projectiles per shot, I'm assuming those are 3 individual projectiles. So assuming that each of those can crit, I think a crit build might actually work for this weapon. It did pretty well with me on the copy that was given to me, and I like the way that it felt. So regardless of how you perk it, if you're going to span your aim across a crowd of enemies and hit multiples at once, I was able to, depending on how I moved, fire 2 shots, then a third, or 1 shot, then 2, and just kind of time it right to hit enemies a lot more effectively. I found this to be a very, very versatile weapon and a super fun thing to use. Without further ado, though, what are the best perks for this thing? So seeing as this is the only legendary copy that I have, we're going to be going off of a level 12 vacuum tube launcher, but of course you're going to want to max this thing out if you're going to be using it for yourself. I'm going to start with the element. You're probably going to want to go nature. There are a lot of different choices here, but I think the cheapest and easiest option is to just stick with nature on this. It will restrict you to nature and water zones, as you will be doing abysmal damage in a fire zone. So that is something to consider, but that's true for all vacuum tube weapons. I'm assuming you're kind of knew that already. As for the 5th perk, you pretty much only have one option if you're not using some of the other 6 perks. So we have damage to Affliction and damage to Slowed and Snared. If you have that 6th perk, it's okay. That's completely fine. I genuinely don't think any 6th perk that this weapon has will cause me to recommend you to not use this weapon. Now, of course, with the damage to Slowed and Snared or Affliction, you are going to have to hit each enemy once in order for that effect to finally be activated with the 2nd shot. As I mentioned, you are shooting 3 shots at a time, so it's not that bad, but it is something to consider that the 45% is appealing when it's maxed out here, but it's not actually 45%. I've explained this in a lot of my other videos, so I'll try to be quick, but essentially when you hit an enemy, you get no bonus. The 2nd shot will be a 45% extra damage, which will average out to be about a 22.5% damage bonus, and then it's only on the 3rd shot that you're actually getting about a 30% damage, you know, on a per shot basis. I've explained this in the past in situations where your alternate option is a damage perk. That's not the case here, but my point is the damage to Afflict and Slowed and Snared sounds nice, but it's not really recommended. So even though I still consider this a usable weapon, even if you have the Slowed and Snared or damage to Affliction 6 perk, I do think you're going to want to look to one of these other options. Now, eliminating an enemy causes a chain lightning strike is really, really good, as I already showed. It's really great for area of effect damage, but dealing 44% bonus damage to water enemies, which, as I said, is what you should be aiming at anyway, is also a really good bonus. I genuinely don't think either of these perks are better than the other. I think that is going to come down to preference. Do you need better single target damage or better group damage with the chain lightning strike? That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you which one to use because I think they're both great. As for the 5th perk, obviously you want Slowed and Snared or Affliction. Just match it to your 6th perk depending on what copy you have. If you're using a Chain Lightning or a damage to water element, then honestly there are a couple of options here. So the damage to Stun, Staggered, or Frozen is something that rarely gets any attention. However, because this is a vacuum tube weapon, I don't know if you noticed this, but you're actually stunning enemies with this. I'm not entirely certain if that's every single hit. If it is, that's great, but it's kind of the same thing I talked about with the damage to Affliction. So you could do that extra damage to stunned enemies, seeing as you're going to be stunning them constantly, but it's only going to be active after your first shot, and I already explained that. So my recommendation is probably damage to mist monsters and bosses, because that is where you're going to be having the most trouble. I think I had to test this in a 132 zone, as there weren't any water elements in the 140 zones. In the 132 zone, as you can see, I wasn't really having any trouble with any enemy whatsoever. So frankly, I think the damage to mist monsters and bosses is something that you could put on here safely and never have to think about again. Just know that mist monsters, and especially smashers, are just going to be a lot easier to take down. Not to mention, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they are rarely elemental, so that's also something to consider, that extra damage could make up for some loss there. I'm going to skip to this middle perk because I think it's kind of obvious. Reload. You're going to want to reload on this. Just trust me. You don't want to spend too much time on the fight. If you don't care about a slow reload, then extra damage is a win. That's just an easy answer. Don't go durability. It's just not worth it, in my opinion. If you're going to be using this in the late game, I'm hoping you can afford it. You know what? No. If you're using the vacuum tube launcher with the sheer amount of energy cells that this thing takes, you could afford to craft another. All right, I highly recommend reload or damage depending on your preference. I'll be going reload, no questions asked. And that brings me to the crit build versus damage. So double damage is always what I recommend for launchers, just because one shot is all you get. You don't want to roll the dice hoping you crit, but you're shooting 3 times with this, and I think that's something to consider. Frankly, I don't really think it matters. Crit rating, crit damage will be the better option in the long run. You will do a total damage output that's higher than double damage, and seeing as based on what I observed and what I figure, each of those 3 shots you fire have their own chance to crit. On average, with a 38% chance to crit, not guaranteed, but on average, you will be critting every single time you fire this weapon. And that enough is good enough for me to run crit build on this. I think that's a safe way to go. If you want total consistent damage and you don't want to trust crits, even though they're pretty reliable, you of course can go double damage, and trust me, you're going to be just fine. Hell, the vacuum tube bow that I mentioned earlier, you might have noticed I run triple damage on it. I never switched it back to crit because it was doing just fine. I never noticed a difference, and we're talking about like 9% damage difference here. It's really not that big of a deal. I haven't done the math for the launcher itself, but on the old SMGs we used to test back in the day, 9% was a pretty consistent difference between double damage and crit rating crit damage. Even if that number is off, it's a pretty small amount. So that's my final recommendation. If all of that was very confusing, let me break it down in the simplest way possible. Eliminating an enemy causes a chain lightning, and weapon hits deal damage to water enemies. Those are the two that you want. In that case, you want damage to mist monsters and bosses, or damage to stunned, staggered, frozen. That's kind of up to you guys. I recommend a crit build. I think it's better than double damage, but double damage is good anyway. I recommend a reload, but if you're okay with a slow reload time, or if you're one of those people abusing the reload glitch, then of course you can just roll a damage perk on this, at least temporarily. Obviously, I recommend nature, as it's kind of your only option, but that's pretty much it. Kind of a long video for a pretty intricate weapon. Very, very cool. I'm glad that they made an old weapon better and then better again. Like, the 40% damage buff was enough. Now, not a lot of people were using this weapon, but adding these extra 6 perks really make it a better experience. And for those of you who didn't already know, as I'm recording this, it is a researchable weapon. You can go down here, and you know what? I might even do it just for the video, because I would love a copy of this with a new 6 perk. You can just research it just like that. Head over to your schematics, check what you got. I got snared. So, yeah, I mean, I am gambling, but it would have been cool if I got one of the fancy new 6 perks, but you yourself could go and get one of those yourself. If you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to use code Mista to check out. As of recording this, Epic has just filed suit against Apple. This isn't really news that I'm going to be covering in this video. It's totally off topic, but it has made it so that all V-Bucks are 20% off permanently. Kind of cool. And the split that creators are getting as of recording is still the same as it always was. So please, I'm going to reinforce, use code Mista to check out if you're taking advantage of these cheaper V-Bucks. This is apparently not a sale, and they're claiming this is permanent. So pretty cool on Epic, I guess. Way off topic for this video, but something I figured I should mention, seeing as I am asking you to use my codes. You should know what's going on with that. If you guys want to be a channel member, you can absolutely do that. I have been streaming on Twitch recently, so I'll be linking that below, of course. You can check out my streams there. I tag on Discord every time I go live, but if you want to get some nice member perks, you can see them there. Click the join button if you want to support me. Thank you guys so much for watching this longer video than usual. I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a nice day. And then